Okay. Hello and good morning, and welcome to this session of the Next System Convergence. My name is Dhruv Deepak. Uh, this session is titled Decolonizing Cooperative History, and it's going to be run by Matthew Epperson. Matthew, take it away.
All right, thank you so much, Drew. All right, yep. So as mentioned, my name is Matthew Epperson. It's an honor to be with you all today. And yeah, as mentioned, my presentation is Decolonizing Cooperative History. So I'm going to use slides largely from my presentation, but that said, I'm happy to stop myself at any time, basically, if folks do have questions. We did allocate on the schedule an hour, although I've got really up to 90 minutes personally. If folks want to stay on afterward, I know there's other sessions to get to, but I've got remarks prepared more or less for up to an hour. But also, I love questions. I think that makes it so much more rich and interactive. So I'm going to start sharing my screen. And that's the wrong screen, I think. There we go. All right. And again, good morning. Or good day, wherever you are in the world. Thank you so much for joining me today. And yeah, let's get it started. Decolonizing cooperative history. So I wanted to start off with a couple of disclaimers. I'll also go into more about who I am and all this topic. But two things about you might notice from the title itself of today's presentation. So I'm not personally trained in any particular form of post-colonial or decolonial theory or practice for that matter. So, for those who are interested, if you're looking for more of the sort of the background or theoretical lens, there's lots of, great post-colonial and decolonial authors like Spivak, Fanon, Baba, and Said, or with decolonialism, Quijano, Mignola, Dussel, or Lugones, who I understand. I'm actually not much of a scholar myself in this regard, but I understand they're great informative readers and thinkers in this space. And the second disclaimer is that I'll be addressing cooperatives, as you saw, noun, in this context today when I say decolonizing cooperative history. So, what am I really talking about there is really the noun form, which is generally referring to an ownership model, usually refers to an entity type, but in this case, I use the word group of people who are doing some kind of revenue generating activity that will be in service of some kind of members who are usually owners of that particular entity. And sometimes there's a mission associated with that service to members, maybe bigger than serving just those members. And with the other caveat that if you would like to talk about what it means sort of as an adjective or as a character trait to be cooperative, I'm happy to engage that, but that's going to be more so after the session. Or if folks have questions about what that means, more as the adjective form. So to get into sort of my plan for the hour, so I've packed in a lot, so I'll be moving fairly quickly, but I'll also try to speak slowly. And I love feedback. If anybody wants to say I need to slow down, please let me know. So my plan was to talk a little bit about myself and my journey to making this presentation and being with you here today, and then to open that lens to what's called the International Cooperative Alliance, and it's what they call the Statement on the Cooperative Identity. Then introduce a sort of very related organization called the International Labor Organization, or the ILO, and a particular recommendation that related back to the cooperative identity called the Recommendation 193. Then I want to shift gears and then informalize the conversation in the sense of more explicitly addressing the informal economy and focusing on a particular kind of informal structure called a ROSCA, which is a rotating savings society. And then I want to revisit the co-op identity, now adopting more of a decolonial lens and looking differently at the history that I had presented and opening it up again, sort of this to this other philosophy, another way of being called Ubuntu or Ubuntu, and how that could be implemented in a different kind of cooperative theorization and practice. I want to sketch, and I am underline the word sketch because it'll be very quick, but a few different non-European cooperative histories, and then a more formal Q&A wrap-up time. So again, feel free to jump in with questions. All right, so who am I? I am Matthew Epperson. I'm coming to you from Athens, Georgia today. So I am an MMCCU, and you'll find out what that means. That's my title there or sort of my letters, because I have this particular MBA, which is a cooperative MBA, Masters of Management of Cooperatives and Credit Unions. I use the he, him pronouns. I am currently a board director with the Hive Mind Community Investment Cooperative, which is a permanent real estate project and capital fund based in Athens, Georgia. I also work nationally as a board director with Shared Capital Cooperative, which is a national CDFI loan fund that focuses on lending from and to cooperatives. I also work locally with the Georgia Center for Employee Ownership, which is, you'll see me in the photo. I was posing for the Center for Employee Ownership here as an outreach coordinator, trying to talk to business owners about why they should sell their business to their employees, particularly through worker cooperatives. But my history, which I'll chart a little bit of a sketch here, is I've been in finance as well as human resources with my local co-op in Athens called Daily Groceries Co-op, which is a food grocery cooperative. I was also the founder of a nonprofit organization in 2017 called the Georgia Cooperative Development Center. I took a brief stint in the world of retail finance with a credit union, which is a member-owned financial institution called Suncoast Credit Union. I was also the business director for a platform co-op in the healthcare research space called Savvy Cooperative. And more recently, I was what was called an employee ownership domain expert for a software startup called Zolidar so sort of like beginning of 24 to the beginning of 2025. So to put that in more picture form quickly for you, there's my family. I grew up in southern Florida, in Tampa, Florida. Uh, Coming into about 2010, 2011, I was a college student in Athens, Georgia, at the University of Georgia, which I like to attribute more to its music history rather than its football history. But, you know, people believe what they believe about places. And then in 2017, as I mentioned, I founded the Georgia Cooperative Development Center. In 2017, you'll see this is a group I worked with, continue to work with actually, called Market 166, which is a startup grocery co-op in Southwest Atlanta. And I've also had a chance to visit some of these very sort of densely cooperative projects around the world, particularly in Europe, though, which I think is very actually relevant to this story, including in Basque Spain, northern Spain, the Mondragon Cooperative Corporation I got to visit because of this co-op master's program, and I visited back in 2014. And then more recently, Emilia-Romagna, Italy, which is the densest cooperative economy in the world. Their GDP, around 30% of the GDP there is produced by cooperatives. So it's a hotbed of activity as well as study for those who kind of nerd out on co-op history and practice. So to kind of situate you into like again like my entryway to this story about sort of what is cooperative history really came to shape because of this master's program. So I like to jokingly say this was my hippie MBA program that I did from 2012 to 2015. Again, this is MMCCU, which is the Masters of Management of Cooperatives and Credit Unions, that I found out about because I was a board director of a food co-op in my college town of Athens, Georgia. Didn't really expect to be doing higher education at all, so I was surprised to find out you could do a master's in co-op management. And thankfully, it was, it's all virtual, so I was able to do it even though the program is based in Canada. Living in Georgia at the time, and, continuing to live here, I was able to pursue this master's for 3 years. So I was very excited to, you know, as you can probably imagine, I was just like manifesting anything and everything co-op that I could at that time in my life. So soaking up, taking in a master's program was very exciting for me. So, as with any, sort of college program or formal higher education, there's going to be a certain sort of a pedagogy and a worldview, you might say, about like what we're studying, which in this case was supposed to be cooperative management. So, as you might imagine, cooperative history was one of the courses that I would be taking in the course of this master's program. And so I was introduced to authors like David Thompson as well as Brett Fairbairn, who, as you can see right from this title of the book, Weavers of Dreams, state that the modern cooperative movement, so-called, was founded by these weavers. And this picture here is of a town in Lancashire, England, called Rochdale. And oftentimes the Rochdale pioneers are the ones who are attributed, as you see here, as the founders of the cooperative movement that I was then finding myself a part of, but had no sort of context for other than, oh, I'm working in a grocery store and it's owned by the customers. So that must be, sort of a difference from what is obviously typical in terms of the experience of working anywhere or being a part of a business. And so to take that, analysis a bit further, Rochdale, again, was an industrial town in Lancashire, England. And at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, so this is about 1844, was a town in which the Rochdale Pioneers, so-called, established their consumer cooperative, which itself was also a grocery store. And according to the National Cooperative Alliance, is now recognized internationally as the birthplace of the modern cooperative movement, which I will be challenging a little bit here today. Interestingly, if you actually look at the International Cooperative Alliance's website, the earliest record of a cooperative actually comes from Fenwick, Scotland. And again, this is per the National Cooperative Alliance. The earliest record of a cooperative comes from Fenwick, Scotland in 1761 in a barely furnished cottage where local weavers manhandled a sack of oatmeal into John Walker's whitewashed front room and began selling the contents at a discount, forming the Fenwick Weavers Society. So that just to mention that even 1844 is sort of it's situated as this like hot, this flashpoint of like this is where it really started, but it's got a little bit of a harkening back to like the end of the 18th century, 1761, but still is very situated in this like European context, right? Like we'll say that okay, let's say Scotland was where it actually like really started, is where this kind of narrative goes. And if you actually look at the sort of definitions, they make it very clear, and this is actually from the guidance notes of the International Cooperative Alliance, which we'll talk about who that is, what is the ICA. They actually literally define by their viewpoint, the founders are the philosophical thinkers and founders of the cooperative movement who pioneered the development of co-ops in different countries and on different continents during the 19th and 20th centuries. I called out the word continents here because if you take a look at who is being attributed as the founders, there's something I think a little curious about this. So we've got Robert Owen, Wales, England, and Scotland. We've got Desjardins in Quebec, Canada, Fourier and Guide in France, Dr. King in England, Hermann Schulz de Leech in Germany, etc. We've got Ireland, again, Canada, Mondragon, Spain, and then Rochdale, England. So with the exception, right, of Canada, this is basically all European countries and European thinkers. So I think there's a fairly sort of narrow kind of viewpoint happening here. Then my story got more interesting, I would say. My understanding got more interesting when I had the pleasure of meeting Dr. Jessica Gordon-Emhart for the first time back in 2013, I believe it was. And in 2014, she published this really landmark book called Collective Courage. So my understanding of cooperative history was thereby really expanded. And I thought this was an interesting quote that kind of explains like where Jessica was at the time. She said, while presenting the general theory that co-ops are an important strategy for economic development for African Americans and discussion or analysis with others, two major questions arose for her. Have Black folk ever practiced cooperative economics? And why would resources be allocated for this? I became very curious about the first question as I began to talk more about cooperatives as a strategy for Black community economic development. And more people told me that Black people do not participate in co-ops. So I set out to determine whether and how much African Americans have been involved in cooperative economics and why African American memories and histories do not include cooperative practices or address cooperative strategy. So in the wake of the UN celebration of the cooperatives in 2012, which she doesn't mention here, but that was largely because of the International Cooperative Alliance influencing the United Nations to declare 2012 as the International Year of the Co-op. This book offers a history of African American cooperative economic development, documenting significant Black involvement in the cooperative movement, and is my hope that it will help us understand the challenges and celebrate the successes of African American cooperative activity. So I mentioned that because I would say that sort of the state of practice, you might say, about the teaching of cooperative history was where Dr. Jessica Gordon-Emhart was back in 2014, which is on this journey of, oh, I'm hearing that Black folks don't do co-ops. How could that be? She had an intuitive sense that that's really not true, but would have to dive into more of the research to try to prove that point. So in her research, she draws from a variety of places and people in a kind of act of what's sometimes called Sankofa, which is a symbol and a philosophy originating from the Akan people of Ghana, meaning to go back and fetch it or go back to get it. And what she's fetching draws from many obscured or invisibilized Black histories of the United States. But one shining exception, of course, was W.E.B. Du Bois, who in Atlanta, not far from myself, being in Athens, wrote his Economic Cooperation Among Negro Americans, published at the turn of the 20th century, to do his own, sort of looking back in a research project to be like, this isn't this is something that needs to be documented the way that, African Americans, the way that Black folks are using cooperatives. And so where I was sitting then, having read Collective Courage, I was finishing this master's program. So it was a 3-year master's program. In the middle of it, I was visiting Mondragon in Spain and learning about that kind of particular lineage of Basque Spain, that kind of cooperativism and worker co-op, which has inspired so much of the world. But also this so much closer to home, this kind of cooperative movement that Dr. Jessica Gordon-Nimhard was pointing to with Collective Courage. So I got to meet her for the first time attending what I call a uniquely Southern and Black worker co-op focused conference called Co-op Econ, which was held at the Rural Training Center of the Federation of Southern Cooperatives back in 2012. And like Jessica, I was also aware of 2012 as the International Year of Co-ops, and within an effort that was launched then by the ICA called the Blueprint for a Cooperative Decade. And in it, they set out goals like this ambitious plan for this blueprint or the 2020 vision. So, it was called a decade. However, this was referring really to 2013 to 2020. And so they were aiming for the, cooperative form of business by the year 2020 to become what they called the acknowledged leader in economic, social, and environmental sustainability, the model preferred by people, and the fastest growing form of enterprise. And it was going to do this by looking through 5 different pillars. So participation in cooperatives, sustainability, access to capital, legal frameworks, which we'll talk a lot about here. And then finally, identity, which they're referring there to the cooperative identity. And so coming into 2015, what you see here, actually obscured this part of the photo, but this title you see here of Struggle and Hope Toward a Blueprint for a U.S. Southern Co-op Decade was my capstone paper for the master's program, where I was trying to bring these worlds together in some sense. I knew that there was this international movement. I knew there was something happening very exciting here in the U.S. South with Co-op Econ. Do these things connect to each other? So I used a survey methodology and relied upon largely the Federation of Southern Cooperatives, the oldest, sort of Black farmer cooperative network in the United States, to try to survey the farmer members of the Federation of Southern Cooperatives about this blueprint, asking them questions like, well, first, are you aware of the blueprint? Are you, potentially aware of the National Cooperative Alliance? How do you think about the cooperative identity, which we'll talk about? Um, do you identify with the 7 cooperative principles that are, claimed to be sort of this, um, guidance note that might be offered to cooperators around the world? And by and large, what I was hearing back, it was challenging to get survey responses, in and of itself. That's just research, but what I was hearing by and large was no, like most people on the ground in the US South are not thinking about the National Cooperative Alliance, even if they're working in co-ops every day, if they're making their livelihood as a farmer, working in a Southern Federation of Cooperatives, they're not thinking about the ICA, they're not thinking about this blueprint. There's definitely a disconnect there. But there's a lived practice, right? There's embodying these principles, but without any sort of conscious, like, oh, now I'm, practicing principle 2, democratic member control, or, when I drop in on a training session, this is principle 5. That's not really happening. That's not how the international movement and the local movement connect to each other. So I was left with a sense of like, okay, well, it's sort of I was kind of coming to the conclusion back in 2015, like, oh, there's an informal connection here. The folks are embodying what the ICA is talking about, but they don't use that language necessarily. So that's me up in Canada in Halifax. So in 2015, I graduated from that program with a few of my classmates here, largely Canadian cooperators, not too many Americans, in fact, in this co-op master's program. And then trying to figure out, okay, well, what comes next after I get a master's in co-op management, living here still in Athens? Well, I decided that from my sort of, ecosystem analysis of the Southeast, that looking around the US, that there are these structures called co-op development centers, and there's a national organization called Cooperation Works that trains people in the practice of cooperative development. So this would be, a person who actually helps people get co-ops started, mostly startups, potentially transitions, so folks who might be like the Georgia Center for Employee Ownership, helping people actually sell their business to their employees. Whereas the co-op development centers are more so on the startup side. They're more so interested in let's start new co-ops and offer technical assistance to get that accomplished. So this is a picture here of the launch event for the Co-op Development Center called the Georgia Co-op Development Center. You can actually see the visual influence from Co-op Econ on the logo that we ultimately created for Georgia Co-op Development Center is the gear icon, which if you look back here, you notice the shamelessly the O's of Co-op Econ were very influential on my graphic design choices with the Georgia Co-op Development Center. So we chose the gear, but then we also embraced this is actually very much international, cooperative alliance symbolism. The ICA, this twin pines as a symbol of cooperation, but I put the southern take on that. So these are actually loblolly pines. So it's southern pine tree, but still the twin pines of cooperation there in the middle of the logo, as well as the Piedmont region, the U.S., the Southeast. So again, sort of coming out of this master's program, I was just sort of in the space of like, well, what do I do? How do I carry this forward? Well, I was still working at the same time with Daily Groceries Co-op. This is my little grocery co-op in Athens. For the most part, doing well, doing fine, but simultaneously trying to be a co-op developer on the side until unfortunately back in 2018, 2019, we lost one of our leaders who was a strong African American woman who was one of our leaders, a leadership team at the grocery co-op over discrimination, and there were pieces of this that were very like systemically implicating not only the co-op but the board of directors as well as the general manager and myself as part of the leadership team as well, that we collectively failed one of our employees. And so at the time, I had reached out for help, as you do, which in fact is a cooperative principle, Principle 6. Reached out to another co-op called AORTA, called the Anti-Oppression Resource and Training Alliance, to try to help us work through really what was then consciously named once we started working with AORTA, which is anti-Black racism that was showing up in the food co-op where I was working, and to try to work through that. But ultimately, it was a very unsatisfactory conclusion, suffice to say, which we could get into if folks want to. But it left me wanting in many ways of like, I need more tools, I need better language, I need sharper analysis, to be an effective cooperative manager and to avoid, a situation like this ever repeating where we lose, talented leaders of color working in the cooperative space. So it's very, relieved to find that like the field itself of cooperative development, related to the practice of teaching cooperative history, because a lot of what ends up happening as a co-op developer is you're teaching co-op history. The state of practice of co-op development was changing, that now there was amazing new resources like this Solidarity resource, which created this anti-racist facilitation guide to cooperative development. This is a couple of years ago. This has been available now, creating just more tools and better analysis than ever before about how to take this kind of a lens when you're helping people help themselves to form cooperatives. But I would say that the whole thing blew up in my brain again when I heard Kasha, who's one of the founders of a real estate cooperative in Western Massachusetts called the Willow Permanent Real Estate Co-op, or Willow Prec, made this quote, which to me was like a mic drop moment. It continued as part of the conversation, but Mike Strode here with Collective Diaspora was asking Cache the question of like, do you identify as a cooperative developer? And she responded, there's this idea that colonizers came in and told you everything you were doing was wrong, and here's a new system of doing it. And now they're coming back and saying, actually, our ancestors were wrong, you were right, and we're going to give you back your own indigenous tools and call it something different and say, we discovered it, right? And it just like hit me of like, wow, is this what's happening? Like, is this what cooperative development is? And I'm not here to say that like I'm going to, wholesale throw out the practice of cooperative development. I'm not saying that, but I think it's an incredibly important analysis that we need to think about as co-op developers, as teachers of co-op history, uh, that we need to be centering the voices of folks of color in terms of the histories and the tools and technologies really that are built into what it means to build co-ops, and that this is just not happening nearly enough, in my view, today. So that was more time than I expected to talk about my story to bring you into this moment. So I'm gonna have to move a little more quickly than I wanted to originally, but I want to also then take us back to the international level about how this all happens then at that sort of most macro level, and then we'll also bring it back to the micro level. So looking at the International Cooperative Alliance and what it calls the Statement on the Cooperative Identity. You've probably gotten this sense that like the ICA is this international non-government organization. It's the largest apex cooperative organization. So, the idea is that there's this federated structure that primary co-ops, like a little grocery co-op in Athens, Georgia, join into a national co-op called like NCBA, which is the National Cooperative Business Association. That US level co-op will belong to the International Cooperative Alliance. So it'll be at least three levels of cooperative membership until you reach an international organization that takes it upon itself to state that it can hold the cooperative identity, the cooperative history, and in fact define cooperative history is kind of the project of the International Cooperative Alliance, which was founded in 1895. So I mentioned 1895 because that's then, so about 1844, we're talking about at least 50 years later after those Rochdale pioneers that I pointed to previously, those weavers in a small town in England. By 50 years later, there was a cooperative congress coming together, which included, again, many, as you can see here, some exceptions, not entirely European nations, right? So we do have Argentina at the table. We have India, we have Serbia. So, there's, well, Serbia's in Europe. But anyway, for the most part, still like a very sort of Eurocentric kind of bringing together of nations to form this international cooperative alliance. Um, and part of what they've sort of defined again is this sort of statement on the cooperative identity, which includes these three different parts, one of which is a definition. So that's what is a co-op? 10 values, which are supposed to be sort of broad philosophical statements about sort of the meaning of cooperation. And then seven principles, which are then supposed to be more sort of practice-oriented, implementations of those philosophical values. And we'll talk about what does this really mean. But that's just to give you a sense of what is this statement on cooperative identity. So what does change over time are principles, so those seven principles are understood by the ICA to be mutable. They're changeable, they're evolving, they're not the Ten Commandments in the sense of these are quite open to editing. They didn't come from God, they came from people, right? So there's enough humility, I think, in this process to recognize that like those things should change, should be updated, should take account of like whatever changing conditions will guide people differently about sort of cooperativism as practices can inform what it means to cooperate. So back in 1937, that's actually almost 100 years after the Rochdale pioneers, they enunciated for the first time what they call these Rochdale principles, and there were seven of them at the time. Uh, a few of them have been very common. So the first four, open membership, democratic control, distribution of surplus, and limitation on payment of capital. Those first four have been very common across the three different versions of the International Cooperative Alliance's principles. But there's been some changing of flavor on the later principles, like what they called at the time political and religious neutrality, which didn't exist in 1966, as well as cash trading, which is very much of its time to not extend any form of credit as a recommendation. Kind of hard, probably for us today, to imagine that an international business alliance would suggest you really shouldn't extend credit to anyone, you know, in a world now that runs so much on credit, but obviously, modern digital payment systems. And then finally, promotion of education, which that one actually has been very consistent across the three versions. So then there was an update. The Congress came back together in 1966, and then again in 1995. So what we currently have, the seven core principles today, were defined back in 1995. And that was actually the first time that the name Rochdale Principles was officially changed. So they're not officially called the Rochdale Principles anymore. They are now called the Cooperative Principles to give a more generic step, and I would say in the right direction to slightly more decenter the European experience to now call them the co-op principles rather than the Rochdale principles. And we're currently in the process with the International Cooperative Alliance, and I say we loosely. I think most folks here, including myself, don't feel particularly closely tied to this process. But I did want to mention that the International Cooperative Alliance is in a consultation process right now, whereby they are taking feedback. There actually is a website you can go to. I didn't put it here, but anyway, you can go to the online discussion. You can put forth your ideas about changing these principles. I did notice last night, it looks like a total of two people have contributed to their online forum. So it looks like they could use a lot more participation, which is not surprising, that like people it can be already a lot of work to be involved in your own cooperative, let alone the International Cooperative Alliance. So anyway, all that to say that the world this is in flux currently, right? That there's a moment now opening once again where 1995 can then become, say, 2026, that we see a fourth version of these cooperative principles. And, so to give the ICA some credit for this about trying to listen to the world about what it means to be a cooperative, they've already put out some initial results. I just used a black box here because I was moving quickly. But I just wanted to point out here that, there is some recognition already that, the current SCI, which stands for the Statement of Cooperative Identity, might need to be updated for reasons such as I wanted to draw emphasis to this middle area because of certain philosophical aspects, including it having a Eurocentric perspective, and it needs to account for anti-colonialism and anti-oppression. And then this is actually an excerpt from some folks who have already offered feedback about the principles, where someone says, as you well know, there is a missing aspect on racial equity and inclusion. Concern for community, which is the seventh principle, is not enough. The co-op movement is driven by Western and white culture. It needs to be called out and fixed. I'm pretty disappointed this part of the discussion is not being directly addressed. It will be missed by many given that it is only addressed in the comment section. And then, this is real, it's important, do better, was one respondent who I thought deserved shouting out already, who's been involved in this process. And also to mention that, especially when there's a mention of a Principle 8, which is a proposal. So there is no current Principle 8. This is a theoretical Principle 8 to add to these, would be an explicit DEI principle, diversity, equity, and inclusion, which is being called for by an American cooperative leader in the credit union world named Maurice Smith, who's actually based in North Carolina, a fellow Southerner, who's been calling for an eighth cooperative principle. Yeah, that would explicitly address DEI, so-called. So now I want to talk a bit more about the International Labor Organization, or the ILO, and then I want to explain what that has to do with the cooperative identity, because I think that this is a very important piece in the story about co-op identity. Is it's one thing to be an international NGO and to tell the world that, here's a set of principles. This is what we think are maybe best practice or philosophical ideas that we think all cooperators around the world should be acknowledging, should be utilizing. But the ILO, I would argue, is where actually those principles sort of are where rubber meets road. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. So, who are the ILO? The International Labor Organization. It's a specialized agency of the United Nations that started around a similar time to the International Cooperative Alliance, began in 1919. It brings together governments, employers, and workers to set labor standards, develop policies, and promote decent work around the world. It's the only UN agency that has a tripart structure, which gives voice to workers, employers, and governments. It's worked hand in hand with the International Cooperative Alliance really since its beginning. I mentioned here Albert Thomas, who was an active cooperator and very involved in the International Cooperative Alliance, was the first director of the International Labor Organization. So again, this very sort of hand in glove relationship between the United Nations, the International Labor Organization, and the International Cooperative Alliance, all working together on things like advocacy, research, and capacity building. So again, how does that connect back? Well, the ILO back in 2002 sort of took what the ICA created in 1995 when they said, here are 7 principles, and made that into what they called Recommendation 193 on the promotion of co-ops in 2002. So it was a policy platform which recognized the role of co-ops in creating sustainable jobs, empowering so-called marginalized communities, and fostering social cohesion. And it encourages governments to develop policies, and that's the important part here, encouraging governments to develop policies that support autonomous and member-driven cooperatives. So with the adoption of R193, this is over 100 countries. Think about that. Over 100 countries now have cooperative laws because of Recommendation 193. Between 97 and 2014, 97 of the 185 ILO member states were involved in the review, modification, or initiation of new cooperative laws and policies influenced by Recommendation 193. So this was indeed a landmark piece of legislation, or model legislation, you might say, whereby the ILO is, speaking to countries all over the world and saying, here's a set of co-op laws that we suggest you adopt. And then what does that really mean, right? Is that all sorts of countries all over the world are suddenly having these new cooperative laws appearing. And as I mentioned here, from some documentation, particularly about the African experience of receiving some of these cooperative laws, when colonial powers introduced co-ops in Africa using these structures, they imposed a formal and Western model that was often disconnected from those existing local economic traditions, like Roscas, we'll talk about what that means, tontines, and burial societies. And this was thus an imported kind of cooperative, which thereby many times served very colonial interests, especially organizing farmers around export crops rather than the needs of local communities. As a result, co-ops were seen as foreign institutions and often failed to resonate with the values and practices of the people on the ground. So you can kind of already see when I talk about decolonizing cooperative history, this is really what I'm getting at, that there's this way that something that I would argue does mean very well. It means good things to, it wants good things for the world, forming, these people-centered organizations, which are called co-ops. But when these structures are plopped into other parts of the world with disregard for local conditions, it can actually ultimately end up being a colonial project, whether it was intended to be or not. So Tio Molefe, who we'll talk about in a moment, stated that contrary to common misconception, the introduction of the European co-op model in other places as well, so Asia, Latin America, and the Arab world, it was seldom benign nor benevolent. It was often a means to aid the settlement of European arrivals and also to dispossess, exploit, or otherwise control native populations in their land, labor, and natural resources in the furtherance of the imperialist project. Again, that doesn't come back to the intentions of the International Cooperative Alliance, but it does come back to the impact that was had by the spreading of the cooperative form around the world. So in that package, the recommendation 193 of the ILO, there was 19 suggestions, and I wanted to call out the ninth suggestion in particular because I find it very interesting language that they were using about what they were recommending to the world. So they stated that governments should promote the important role of co-ops in transforming what are often marginal survival activities, sometimes referred to as the informal economy, into legally protected work, fully integrated into mainstream economic life. So on its face, seems to be very like sort of morally motivated. We're talking about legal protection for people who sound very like precarious. They're trying to survive, operating in what they're calling an informal economy, which is often presented as dangerous, which in many ways it can be dangerous at times. But I would also argue the formal economy can also be quite dangerous to people working on the ground. So I just want to unpack some of these words. So who operates in the informal economy and why do they work in the informal economy? And are these marginal survival activities? Are the questions I want to beg. So to quickly kind of introduce two key thinkers from my current understanding, I want to introduce to you now Dr. Caroline Shanaz Hussain, who is a Canadian cooperator and educator who created a documentary back in 2021 called The Banker Ladies, which I highly recommend, which will go into Roscas or rotating savings and credit associations. And more recently has written the book Beyond Racial Capitalism, which I highly recommend. I've got my copy right here to prove that. Cooperatives in the African Diaspora is the subtitle, written with Sharon D. Wright Austin as well as Kevin Edmonds, all members of what is shown here as the Diverse Solidarity Economies Collective. And then also wanted to introduce you to Tio Molefe, who made a contribution to the newly released Rutledge Handbook of Cooperative Economics and Management, called Beyond the Western-Centered Paradigm in Cooperative Economics, and was the founder of a freelancers co-op called the Collective Media Cooperative, which actually was it was the founding of this co-op in many ways that actually pushed Tio to actually get an MBA in South Africa and to more deeply examine the cooperative identity and how it was relating to his experience as a cooperator, and to ultimately, as he says, push beyond the Western-centered paradigm in cooperative economics. And we'll get into what he means by that. So in that order,
Matthew,
yeah.
sorry to interrupt, and I know you're going with the flow. I just wanted to let you know that it's 9:40. We do have a hard close at 10 because the next session is starting in this window. So just to let you know in case you needed some time for questions and discussions.
Yep, I appreciate
Thanks.
that. Yeah, so I think in that case, yeah, I'll wrap a little sooner than I thought I would. So I'll probably give us like maybe 10 minutes at the end to try to move through this fairly quickly. All right, so Dr. Hussein, points out in Beyond Racial Capitalism that we are countering economic and societal exclusion by basically moving to what she calls a Black social economy of cooperation and self-help. She mentions that this dominant and sort of in the middle here, dominant Eurocentric view, where Black people are already conscious of what they do, is heavily scrutinized. And there's this history of white sabotage. So in many ways, informality is a form of protection, a way to stay safe in a world that is otherwise quote unquote formal, but which actually sabotages and undermines, Black solidarity economy, Black social economy. And you can see in her table of contents and which countries she's covering, whether it's the Eastern Caribbean, Quilombos in Sao Paulo, Brazil, Nigeria, the Caribbean islands. In all cases, these are countries that are not mentioned, as members of the International Cooperative Alliance, as we saw previously. And the Rosca and informal cooperatives are, as she says, not underdeveloped, nor do they engage with the state or private sector as other social institutions do. They're hiding money for emancipation pots for things like the Underground Railroad in the United States. These are, often informal on purpose, and they reached alienated people so as to make a place where they can be just in their full humanity. A Rosca goes by many names, but they all mean rotating savings clubs around the world. And again, these are concepts whereby, like, so a Rosca is a rotating savings circle. The characteristics are folks pool their money together, they're paying out their funds. They have lots of different structures how they do that, but the idea is that with the money go around, folks are, pooling capital and distributing it to each other. And so this is partially just being pointed out because it's a practice that is not officially cooperative, in the sense of a formal ICA recognized definition of what a cooperative is, but I would argue is in fact very much cooperative. That I think these are much older and in fact genuinely and authentically cooperative projects where people are provisioning for their own needs through the saving of money and rotating of money among groups that is in fact very international. It has a much older history than those, European storytelling about, such as the Rochdale pioneers. So I beg the question of a cooperative identity or the cooperative identity. And as you might have guessed from my viewpoint, what I would argue is that what the ICA presents, what the seven principles present, is a cooperative identity, not the cooperative identity. So when we look at the ICA's definition, I think it's important to look at that lens. It's a useful definition. It can be helpful to have for depending on your context. But to state that it would be the end all or be all of the cooperative experience is inherently limited and thus not as useful as it presumes to be to actually speak for all of humanity. Instead, Dr. Hussein calls for us to include informal and formal cooperatives side by side in an updated definition of what a cooperative is, and thus to stop ignoring the contributions of non-Europeans in how we define co-ops. Similarly, Tio Molefe points to this history as a unique and distinguishing moment in the history of the natural human inclination to work together cooperatively, and challenges that 19th century Western Europe could spread that idea, the idea of cooperation, to the rest of the world from Western Europe, and challenges that. It's sometimes been argued that the seven principles are a floor. So as we see in places like Spain or Jackson, Mississippi, the seven co-op principles can oftentimes be integrated with an expanded list that ends up being maybe 10 co-op principles or 13 co-op principles. And I would say that's, absolutely fine. But not, again, not necessarily, that doesn't become equivalent with the idea of assuming the totality of the cooperative identity to even form a floor. And in fact, Tio Molefe points to a particular African philosopher named Magobi Ramos, whose conceptualization of Ubuntu or Ubuntu with a dash in the middle is this particular process that a person is and becomes a person through the relationship with fellow beings, both human and non-human, including the living dead, our ancestors, and the yet to be born, and always a seeking to establish harmonious relations. So what if this were the way that we talked about co-ops, right? Is the question here. Ramos also says that Ubuntu, therefore, in his words, eschews categorical enumeration and universalizing of organizational form, law, values, norms, traits, behaviors, and other means to harmony, as these are situated properties that emerge from actual harmony-seeking interactions of persons involved in the situational relation. So in some ways, this is really begging the question, the broader question of like, could there even be co-op principles if we're talking about ways of organizing relationships between humans that are seeking harmony with each other? Well, TMLFA ultimately comes to I would say offers this conclusion that, well, not to throw out the entirety of the idea, not to say that we couldn't have a universal cooperative identity statement, but that if we took this harmony seeking or Ubuntu as the basis of a cooperative model, it might look just very different from what the ICA defines as a cooperative model. It would involve things like heterogeneity as an assumption rather than a homogeneity, as in my co-op experience that I started by talking about this story with, right? Of like consumers owning a grocery store. Well, we're all customers in a store. That's a very homogeneous kind of relationship. What if instead it's the workers, it's producers, it's consumers, people who live in houses, people who live in communities, or instead of the membership types of co-ops? Emergent scaling. So, folks forming functional units of dyads and triads where like relation and harmony are being sought between each other through what's called open-ended triadic closure, dynamic transformation, ecosophy, polycentric governance, which I think, to my thinking, very much resembles another kind of governance called sociocracy, whereby people form, more decentralized kinds of organization for decision making, non-hierarchical deliberation, seeking consensus at different levels. So what if these things were more of the assumption of cooperation? I think it's a very provocative idea, right? That Ubuntu could inform a whole other worldview, you might say, of what is cooperation. And I want to be clear that I don't think Tio Malefe in this article is talking about replacing the ICA's principles, not to say that like, oh, those 8 Ubuntu co-op principles now should replace the 7 ICA principles. He's very clear to say that his list is not a prescriptive nor even a complete set, and the numbering does not signify rank or particular configuration. Um, this is but one account in his words. So there's definitely a humility baked into his model. Um, and in fact, later on, when I heard him presenting to a book club about the Rutledge Manual, he stated he was of two minds about even enunciating cooperative principles in this manner, but he was willing to do so to sort of codify 8 principles to suggest that the project of the ICA, and these are my words, the project of the ICA, trying to steward a universal cooperative identity is not itself an impossible task, but TO is being very clear that what the ICA has done is not yet accomplishing this goal. And thus, we as cooperators around the world are left to our imagination how it is that something like what the ICA is currently trying to do to update its principles could dance with Ubuntu cooperativism, take account of what is fluid and what is concrete and unchanging, and have them into more of a dialectic and more of a dialogue with each other. So my take is that universal principles could exist, but we've yet to truly see them. And what the ICA's principles represent, like Ubuntu cooperative principles, shows a valuable but non-universal set of co-op principles already in existence. And just to mention that our principles are informed by our histories. TMLFA does a great job of helping us understand and look to different cooperative practices around the world, whether in Korea, in Latin America, among the indigenous people of Canada, as well as New Zealand with the Maori. And similar with the Money Go Rounds book that I mentioned previously, covering the history of Roscas, we can see that rotating savings groups have been around even as early as the ninth century. Much older practice in the Japanese coup has already been documented. If we're just looking to documented histories, we can point to them, which are much older than, and again, much more woman-centric and much more people of color-centric histories that exist around the world. If we're being more honest and de-Europeanized about the way that we tell co-op history. And so Tio points us to saying that being Europe-centered means that the field is operating from an incomplete and inadequate knowledge base. And more than enumeration and explication of the oft-maligned and much ignored cooperative histories and epistemologies of the global majority. Instead, what we should be probably doing is this last paragraph, recentering knowledge and knowledge production toward a more complete and accurate account. And interestingly enough, even if you look to the Rochdale pioneers themselves, I found this very telling that They themselves, the pioneers from 1844, never actually claimed ownership of principles, and they stated that the cooperative ideal is as old as human society, and rather it is the idea of conflict and competition as a principle of economic progress that is new, not cooperative principles. And with that, I'll pause for questions.
So Matthew, we do have one question in the Q&A tab if you turn to that.
Oh, yeah. So John Stubbs says, re ILO 193, beyond the obvious ethics of it all, why would governments ever want to encourage the informal economy and risk sharing power slash taxes with commoners? It seems a little tongue in cheek is kind of the way that I'm reading that question. The risk sharing power taxes with commoners. Is John able to come off of mute to ask that question?
Yeah, I think I can do that. Just give me a sec. There we go.
Hello?
Good morning, John. I can hear you.
Oh, great, Matthew. Oh, yeah, thank you for your presentation. Yeah, I was a bit tongue in cheek, I mean, I'm in New York City, and I see how maybe the COVID pandemic, for instance, put an end to block associations. But it seems like almost a radical idea to have block associations, like maybe seed 1,000 or thousands of block associations with $1,000, which is be like a tiny, like 100th of a% of our budget in New York City. It's 100 something billion-dollar budget. So I just see that basically people who are in power don't really want to share it. Yeah, it's very cynical based on the reality of politics in America, even in a so-called liberal city like New York. Or one more example, participatory budgeting. You know, yeah, $1 million or several $1 million seems like a lot, but it's it's like a 100th of a% of the budget. So it's just like I know math, and I'm not impressed by these little efforts. I'll stop.
Sure. Yeah. No, and I think I'm hearing in your question sort of like what does it should we even be trying if these feel like local experiments that maybe won't have the impact or the scale, and that word scale so frequently being wielded, I think, against community-based organizations. Like, do you have the scale, necessarily to impact? And like I think like a lot of other well-meaning individuals, like I often go back to like Margaret Mead, that Margaret Mead quote about like, a small group of individuals being able to change the world. I think that's still true even today, as we see creeping fascism here and around the world. I still think people coming together at kitchen tables and doing things like Rosca's, savings, creating little saving circles for themselves. I say even I'm using the word little, but like these saving circles, oftentimes are the difference for folks between being able to afford, a daughter's quinceañera or, afford a funeral or, start a business. Oftentimes this is life-changing money that poor people are able to accumulate for themselves. And in fact, they find that the default rates of saving circles are incredibly low around the world. And it's not surprising. Money means so much to the poor that like they're not going to default if they're contributing to a saving circle that they themselves are co-creating. So I think the point is subsidiarity and agency. So I think that those principles will always matter, no matter what the New York City public budget looks like, you know?
And if I could put on my positive hat for a moment, I think the last several years, I think pre-COVID even, a few $1 million again of that huge 100+ billion has been put forward toward co-op development. So yeah, every little bit helps. Amen.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, I definitely applaud the New York City effort. I see a lot of that so I work as I mentioned, the Georgia Center for Employee Ownership. So oftentimes we're looking to like New York City, to other places around the world, like here in Georgia, where we're like, let's learn from New York City about how they, talk to business owners about selling their business to their employees. So I think there's a lot that we can learn from like moving millions of dollars into projects like that. But at the same time, like we also have to be very much appreciative, I think, of the very bottom up efforts oftentimes that don't even interact with people like myself, that even like co-op developers, we have to check ourselves and our power and our part of the process when we create cooperatives, to again, always try to center communities doing for themselves. We should just help as much as we can in the ways that we're asked to, and I think get out of the way otherwise, whether that's how we teach co-op history, or how we teach writing a business plan. It's like all these tools of what a co-op needs to be successful. So do we have any I didn't see anything else in the Q&A.
There's a comment in the chat if you want to address that.
My dear friend Julia is with us. Would you mind coming off mute? I'd love to hear you say that, Julia.
Hi, Matt. Hello, everyone. What a fantastic presentation. It was really refreshing to see other people tackling this question about, cooperative legacies and understanding that it didn't start in Europe and England, and that was just a stream of development among many others in parallel that built this worldwide movement. And at the Media Economies Design Lab at University of Colorado, Boulder, Nathan Schneider and we have been working on a project called Governance Ecologies that's recognizing and building, like mapping a larger repository of governance traditions and cooperative traditions that, even if it's not recognized in that way or named that way, share very much the same principles and practices of many co-ops. And we're looking at indigenous communities, diasporas communities of Quilombola, of past, like descendants of past enslaved people that built their communities and manage them in a very cooperative way. And so we're looking at Latin America and Africa mostly. And it's just really interesting to see this conversation spreading and more people interested in talking about this, talking about this. So thank you so much, Matt.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Julia, for mentioning that. And I'm so excited about what you're doing with the governance ecologies at the Med Lab. And I just shared it I think I shared the right link, hopefully in the chat, so folks can look at that as well. And yeah, just to echo everything you just said and say that I so appreciate, documenting so many different approaches to governance and indigeneity as the real basis of cooperativism, to just really, if nothing else, pluralize the field and then just get rid of these myths, right? That like this just, all emanated from Western Europe, right?
Exactly. This is exactly the type of conversation, because I've seen so many times in different events, conference, and just people referring to the Rockdale as like the pioneers, the founding fathers of the movement. And I'm not saying we should diminish their importance to the movement, but just to recognize, and I love how you quoted, like you mentioned in one of the slides, it's just an incomplete recollection of that history. It's just an incomplete view of that history. And there are different histories, and that is often overshadowed by an Eurocentric perspective on how things developed. And I really appreciate that recognition and seeing other people working around that. And I'd love to connect and follow up on this presentation.
Awesome. Yep. Thanks so much. Yeah. So excited to be with you and Nathan in this conversation. And I just noticed, so Kathy mentioned, I think that's because I just realized, so I'm only able to send this to hosts and participants. Can you help with that, Dhruv?
Yeah, I'll just paste it in right now to everyone. And I have to apologize, but that's time for this session. So thank you very much, Matthew, for your presentation, and thank you everyone for your attention and for participating. And I'm going to end the session now. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thanks so much for being here.